I never imagined that one day I'd be standing in the middle of my own property staring at a hole cut through my fence and realizing that a multi-million-dollar housing development had been stealing from me for weeks. Not tools, not equipment, not livestock, water. The thing is, when most people hear the word water theft, they picture someone hooking up a hose or filling a tank in the middle of the night. What happened to me was a whole different level of arrogance. These people didn't sneak onto my land under cover of darkness. They didn't even try very hard to hide it. They acted like they were entitled to it, like the resources on my property existed solely because they needed them. And that attitude ended up costing them everything. My place sits at the far end of an old gravel road in the foothills outside a small mountain town. 8 acres of rough terrain, scattered pine trees, a modest house, and the one thing that made the entire property worth buying in the first place, a spring-fed pond. When I bought the land nearly a decade ago, the realtor spent 20 minutes talking about the house and maybe 10 seconds talking about the pond. Funny thing is, I barely remember anything she said about the house. I remember every word she said about that water. The pond wasn't huge, but it never ran dry. Even during the hottest summers when neighboring properties were hauling water in by truck, mine stayed stable because the spring feeding it had been flowing for generations. I built my vegetable garden around it. I installed a gravity-fed irrigation system myself. Every tomato, every fruit tree, every raised bed depended on that water. It wasn't just a nice feature, it was the heartbeat of the entire property. Life was pretty quiet until the land next to mine got sold. For years it had been untouched forest and scrubland. Then one morning survey stakes appeared. A month later bulldozers arrived. By the end of the summer there were advertisements everywhere for a luxury development called Summit Ridge Preserve. Mountain views, private roads, exclusive living. The kind of marketing designed to convince wealthy people they were buying wilderness while simultaneously destroying it. At first I didn't care much. It wasn't my land. People develop property all the time. As long as they stayed on their side of the fence, I figured we'd all get along just fine. Then I met the project manager. His name was Brandon Cole. He had that polished corporate confidence that somehow manages to feel rehearsed and arrogant at the same time. Brand new boots, spotless safety vest, expensive sunglasses, constantly talking into a phone even when nobody seemed to be on the other end. One afternoon, he drove over and introduced himself. The conversation started normal enough. He asked about property boundaries, utility easements, access roads, things that actually made sense. Then he started asking questions about water. Not general questions either. Specific questions. Where did my pond get its water? Did it ever dry up? How strong was the spring flow during summer? At the time I didn't think much about it. Looking back now, that should have been the moment alarm bells started ringing. I answered honestly because I assumed he was gathering information for engineering purposes. He nodded politely, thanked me, and left. 3 months passed. Construction intensified. Trucks rolled in before sunrise and left after dark. The noise became part of everyday life. Then I noticed something strange. The pond level seemed lower than usual. At first I blamed myself. Maybe I hadn't paid attention. Maybe the weather had been hotter than normal. But a week later it was noticeably lower. Then another week passed, and it dropped again. Within a month nearly a foot of water had disappeared. That's when concern turned into panic. A spring-fed pond doesn't just lose water for no reason. Something had changed. Every evening after work I walked the shoreline looking for signs of leakage. I checked drainage channels. I searched for cracks in the embankment. Nothing. The math simply didn't add up. Water was leaving faster than nature could replace it. Then one afternoon, I decided to follow the terrain uphill toward the property line. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. I just knew the answer had to be somewhere. About 200 yards from the pond, near the fence separating my property from the development, I found fresh, disturbed soil. The dirt looked newer than everything around it. Then I saw the fence. Or more accurately, I saw the section that had been cut apart. Somebody had sliced through the wire and bent it back just enough to create an opening. My stomach dropped. I stepped closer and immediately spotted something black disappearing underground. A pipe. Not an old pipe. A new pipe. A large one. I followed it. Every step made me angrier. The farther I walked, the more obvious the truth became. The pipe crossed directly from my property into the construction site. When I finally reached the other side, I found exactly what I feared, a massive storage tank sitting beside their concrete mixing operation. My water. their tank, their project. And in that moment I realized this wasn't an accident, a misunderstanding, or some paperwork error. Someone had made a deliberate decision to cut through my fence, tap into the spring feeding my pond, and siphon water onto their site without permission. I stood there staring at it, listening to the machinery rumble in the distance, and thinking about how many times people with money convince themselves that other people's property rights don't matter. What they didn't realize was that they had just picked a fight they were completely unprepared to lose. Now, before I tell you what happened next, let me pause the story for a second because this is where a lot of people misunderstand how these situations actually work. Most folks assume property disputes are all about fences, boundaries, or somebody parking where they shouldn't. But water rights are a completely different animal. According to standard procedure, once a water source is legally registered and attached to a parcel, especially an older spring or natural source, using it without authorization can trigger consequences far beyond ordinary trespassing. From a legal perspective, the water itself often carries separate rights that can be protected independently from the land sitting above it. What fascinated me later was the psychology behind it. This is a psychological trap that large developers sometimes fall into when deadlines start slipping and money starts bleeding out. They become so focused on solving today's problem that they convince themselves they'll deal with the consequences tomorrow. A temporary shortcut becomes a permanent decision. An ethical compromise becomes standard operating procedure. The lesson here is that most catastrophic business failures don't start with massive crimes. They start with small acts of entitlement that people believe nobody will challenge. In this case, somebody looked at my property and saw an easy resource. What they failed to see was the paper trail attached to it. The second I got back to my truck, I started recording everything. Every inch of that damaged fence, every section of exposed pipe, every connection point I could find. I followed the entire line from my side of the property straight into their construction site. The closer I got to their operations area, the more unbelievable it became. This wasn't some emergency setup somebody had thrown together overnight. The trenching was professional. The fittings were installed correctly. The storage system had clearly been integrated into their workflow. Somebody had approved this. Somebody had budgeted for it. Somebody had looked at a map, looked at my spring, and decided stealing was cheaper than solving their own water problem. Once I finished recording, I called Brandon. I didn't yell at first. I wanted to hear what he would say. When he answered, I told him exactly what I'd found. There was a long pause on the line. Not confusion. Not surprise. Silence. The kind of silence that only happens when someone realizes they've just been caught. Finally, he cleared his throat and said they had experienced some delivery issues with their contracted water supplier and had arranged a temporary solution while those issues were being resolved. I remember actually laughing. Not because it was funny, but because the explanation was so absurd. A temporary solution? I asked. You mean cutting through my fence and tapping into my spring? Another pause. Then he said something that still sticks with me. He said, let's not overreact here. That's when I knew exactly who I was dealing with. To him, I wasn't a property owner. I wasn't a neighbor. I was an obstacle. Just another problem to manage until the project was finished. I told him he had one chance to shut everything down immediately. He responded by saying he'd have to discuss it with ownership. That conversation lasted less than 3 minutes, but it told me everything I needed to know. They weren't sorry. They were calculating. So I drove straight into town and walked into the office of an attorney named Victor Reyes. Victor had spent years handling land use disputes, environmental conflicts, and property rights cases throughout the region. When I showed him the footage, he didn't say much at first. He watched the entire recording. Then he watched it again. Then he leaned back in his chair and asked one simple question. Do you have your water rights documentation? Fortunately, I did. A few hours later, we were surrounded by maps, surveys, permits, and decades-old records. What we found changed everything. The spring feeding my pond wasn't just protected. It carried senior water rights dating back generations. The legal protections attached to it were stronger than I ever realized. Victor looked at me and said, they're in serious trouble. The next morning, he filed an emergency injunction. Less than 24 hours later, county officials arrived at my property alongside a hydrologist and an environmental compliance investigator. Watching professionals work is interesting because they remove emotion from the equation. While I was angry, they were methodical. They measured flow rates. They inspected trench depths. They traced every section of pipe. They documented every connection. By the end of the inspection, the hydrologist had enough data to estimate exactly how much water had been diverted from my spring. The number was staggering. More than 17,000 gallons. 17,000 gallons taken over just a few weeks. Water that should have remained in my pond. Water that should have irrigated my garden and protected my property during the dry season. Water that had instead been transformed into concrete foundations for luxury homes. That afternoon, we all drove over to the construction site. I'll never forget the look on Brandon's face when he saw the county vehicles pull in. Suddenly, the confident project manager wasn't smiling anymore. The lead enforcement officer walked directly to the storage tank, reviewed the documentation, and ordered the water system shut down immediately. Brandon started talking fast. He called it a misunderstanding. He claimed there had been confusion regarding access rights. He suggested contractors may have acted independently. The officer wasn't interested. He handed Brandon a cease and desist order and informed him that unauthorized diversion of protected water resources carried significant penalties. The valve was shut off right there on the spot. Everything changed after that. Concrete production stopped almost immediately. You'd be surprised how much modern construction depends on consistent water access. Without water, concrete can't be mixed. Without concrete, foundations can't be poured. Without foundations, schedules collapse. And when schedules collapse, money starts disappearing. Within days, subcontractors began complaining. Within weeks, crews were sitting idle. Excavation teams finished their work and had nowhere to go. Framing contractors couldn't begin because foundations weren't ready. Equipment rental costs kept accumulating. Investors started asking questions. Homebuyers started demanding answers. Then the lawsuits arrived. Victor filed claims for trespassing, property damage, resource theft, environmental interference, and financial losses. The county initiated its own enforcement proceedings. State regulators opened separate investigations. What fascinated me most was watching how quickly the story changed on their side. First, it was a misunderstanding. Then it was an honest mistake. Then it was a rogue contractor. Then it was an administrative oversight. Every week, there seemed to be a different explanation. The problem was that none of those explanations matched the physical evidence. Trenches don't dig themselves. Pipes don't install themselves. Water doesn't accidentally flow through thousands of feet of infrastructure. Somebody made decisions. Lots of them. Discovery during litigation exposed even more problems. Internal emails surfaced. Project timelines surfaced. Budget discussions surfaced. The picture became increasingly ugly. Delays had been mounting long before anyone touched my spring. Cost overruns were already creating pressure. Investors were demanding progress. Buyers were expecting delivery dates. Somewhere along the line, somebody decided that stealing water was easier than admitting the project was in trouble. That's the thing about shortcuts. They rarely stay hidden. Once investigators start pulling on one thread, entire sweaters tend to unravel. Meanwhile, the development's reputation was collapsing. Local newspapers picked up the story. Residents started talking. Potential buyers grew nervous. Existing buyers began withdrawing. Every canceled contract created new financial stress. Every financial problem created more delays. Every delay generated additional penalties. It became a domino effect that nobody could stop. Several months into the legal battle, their attorneys approached Victor about a settlement. The offer sounded large on paper. Victor rejected it. Not because he was being aggressive, but because the damages were still being calculated and regulatory investigations were still underway. A few weeks later, they tried again. Another offer. Another rejection. At some point, they finally realized the situation wasn't going away. The case eventually reached court. By then, the evidence was overwhelming. Survey records established ownership. Hydrology reports established diversion volumes. Inspection records established intent. Video footage established the physical connection. Even their own documents contradicted portions of their defense. The judge didn't seem impressed by any of it. The ruling came down hard. Full restitution, property restoration, environmental remediation, legal fees, additional penalties, ongoing compliance monitoring. It was the kind of judgment that hurts even healthy companies. Summit Ridge Preserve wasn't healthy anymore. Investors had already started pulling back. Buyers had already started abandoning contracts. Lenders had already become nervous. Then came the regulatory fines. Then came the enforcement costs. Then came the secondary lawsuits from contractors and purchasers affected by the delays. The financial pressure became impossible to contain. About 4 months after county officials shut off that valve, the company filed for bankruptcy protection. Just like that, the luxury development that had promised exclusive mountain living became another unfinished project sitting behind locked gates. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had risked an entire development to save money on water deliveries. They had gambled millions to avoid solving a problem legally. And in the end, the thing that brought them down wasn't market conditions, interest rates, or construction costs. It was a single decision made by people who convinced themselves that my property rights didn't matter. Standing beside my pond months later, watching the water level finally recover, I realized something important. Justice doesn't always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it arrives through paperwork, inspections, permits, and court orders. Sometimes it moves slower than we'd like. But when the facts are on your side and you refuse to back down, even the biggest bullies eventually discover that actions have consequences. A lot of people ask me if the whole experience felt satisfying in the end, and honestly, the answer is more complicated than most viewers probably expect. Sure, there was a certain sense of justice when I heard the company had filed for bankruptcy. I'd be lying if I said there wasn't. After everything they put me through, after the stress, the uncertainty, the anger of discovering somebody had been taking from my property without permission, part of me felt like the outcome was deserved. But standing beside that pond months later, listening to the water move through the reeds, and watching the levels slowly return to normal, I realized the real victory wasn't seeing somebody lose. The real victory was protecting something that mattered before it disappeared. That's a lesson I think a lot of people miss these days. We spend so much time focusing on revenge stories that we forget the most important part of any conflict is preserving what was worth fighting for in the first place. My garden survived. My water source recovered. My property remained intact. Those things mattered more than any court judgment ever could. Looking back, I also learned something interesting about power. Most people assume power belongs to whoever has the biggest budget, the largest legal team, or the most expensive equipment. That's what Summit Ridge's executives seemed to believe. They looked at me and saw one guy living at the end of a gravel road. They looked at themselves and saw investors, engineers, contractors, and millions of dollars in backing. What they failed to understand was that power often comes from knowledge, from documentation, from understanding your rights before someone tries to take them away. From a legal perspective, they never really had the advantage they thought they had. They just assumed nobody would challenge them. And that's where things became dangerous for them. This is a psychological trap that affects individuals, corporations, and even entire organizations. When people get away with small acts of entitlement, they start believing the rules don't apply to them. The first shortcut makes the second shortcut easier. The second shortcut makes the third feel normal. Eventually, they stop seeing boundaries altogether. By the time someone finally says, enough, they've built an entire system around the assumption that nobody will push back. According to standard procedure, that's usually when the collapse begins. Not because of one mistake, but because of dozens of smaller decisions stacking on top of each other until the structure can no longer support its own weight. The lesson here is surprisingly simple. If someone violates your rights, document everything. Stay calm. Learn the rules. Let facts do the heavy lifting. Anger might feel good for a few minutes, but evidence wins battles. Paper trails win battles. Patience wins battles. The funny thing is that if those developers had simply knocked on my door and asked for help, we probably could have had a conversation. Maybe not the conversation they wanted, but a conversation nonetheless. Instead, they chose secrecy. They chose arrogance. They chose to act first and explain later. That decision ended up costing them far more than any legal water source ever would have. Even today, whenever I walk past the section of fence that had to be repaired, I think about how close I came to ignoring those first warning signs. If I had waited another month, who knows how much damage would have been done. So now I'm curious what you think. If you discovered a major company secretly using resources from your property, would you have handled it the same way, or would you have taken a different approach? And where do you think the line is between a desperate business decision and outright theft? Let me know down in the comments because stories like this always seem to spark some surprisingly strong opinions. One thing I know for certain, though, the people who cut through that fence thought they were taking water. What they were really doing was digging the first hole in their own grave.